She was 20 years old and, for all intents and purposes, an orphan. Her father had given her $3, the last of her inheritance, and told her to leave. With no family, no prospects, and no plan, she had only a small brass hand lens in her pocket and the $3 silver. And with that money, she walked to the county office and bought a worthless claim on the edge of Silver Bend, a buried mine shaft that had been sealed for 50 years. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the wall of the collapsing shack on that claim was a set of blueprints that would change her life forever. Settle in close for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Etta Mae Calhoun. Etta Mae Calhoun was a child of the mountains, but not of their riches. She was born in Silver Bend, in the years after the silver had played out, when the town was slowly exhaling its last breath of prosperity. Her mother, a gentle woman, with hands perpetually dusted with flour, had taught her the rhythms of a quiet life, how to mend a seam, how to put up peaches, how to read the clouds for a coming storm. Her father, a man who had come to Silver Bend with dreams of a silver strike and found only the bottom of a bottle, saw Etta not as a daughter, but as another mouth, another reminder of his own failed ambitions. He managed the general store, a position he'd inherited and which he resented for its lack of grandeur. He was a man of ledgers and accounts, and Etta was a debit he could not reconcile. It was her mother who had been the buffer, the soft warmth that stood between the father's cold arithmetic and Etta's quiet, watchful nature. When her mother died of a winter fever, the warmth went out of the house, leaving only the chill of her father's disappointment. Etta was 16 then, and she learned to become very still, very quiet, to take up as little space as possible. But there had been another source of warmth in her life, a different kind of teacher. His name was Jedediah Croft, a retired assayer, who lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town. He was a man made of granite and patience, his face a roadmap of canyons carved by sun and time. He had known Etta's mother and saw in the girl a sharp, curious eye that most people missed. He taught her to read not books, but rocks. He would take her up into the tailings piles, the great gray monuments to the town's dead hopes, and show her the world hidden within the stone. He taught her the difference between fool's gold and the real thing, the telltale gleam of chalcopyrite versus the buttery glow of true gold. He showed her how galena broke into perfect cubes and how quartz crystals formed in six-sided prisms. His greatest gift to her, besides his time, was a small brass hand lens with a powerful German glass. "Look closer," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "The world tells its secrets to those who are willing to look." He taught her how to hold it steady, how to catch the light just so, revealing the intricate, glittering architecture inside a common piece of granite. The lens was heavy and cool in her hand, a solid piece of a world that made sense, a world of structure and substance. Jedediah died 2 years after her mother, quietly in his sleep, and the town barely noticed. But Etta kept the lens, carrying it in her pocket always. It was her one beloved object, a connection to the only person who had ever looked at her and seen not a burden, but a possibility. The end of her life in the house on Main Street came not with a shout, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. A year after her mother's passing, her father remarried. The new woman was a widow, from a town down the valley, a woman with a pinched face and a hunger for a fresh start, a start that did not include a grown stepdaughter. Her name was Agnes, and she saw Etta's quiet presence as a judgment, her competence in the house a silent reproach. Agnes began her campaign with whispers, with suggestions to Etta's father about the cost of things, about the need to be practical, about the future. Etta heard them through the floorboards at night, the low murmur of her own erasure. Her father, a man who had always chosen the path of least resistance, did not resist. One Tuesday morning, after a breakfast of cold bread and colder silence, he called her into the small office behind the general store. He did not look at her. He stared at the ledger on his desk, its columns of black ink, a testament to the only language he truly understood. "Etta Mae," he began, his voice flat and administrative. "Agnes and I have decided to sell the house. We're moving. There's a buyer." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "It's all been signed." She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. She had been expecting this, in the way one expects a long, cold winter. She did not cry or plead. She had learned long ago that her father did not respond to emotion. He only responded to accounts being settled. "I've packed a small bag for you," he continued, finally looking up, but his eyes slid past her face, focusing on the wall behind her. "And this." He pushed $3 across the polished wood of the desk. The coins spun for a moment before settling. "This is what's left from your mother's things, after settling the accounts. It's yours. It's time you made your own way." The cruelty was not in the amount, which was an insult, but in its presentation. It was a transaction, a final closing of a ledger. He was balancing his books, and she was the last entry to be cleared. She looked at the 3 coins, shining dully in the lamplight. She thought of her mother's wedding ring, her small collection of books, the hand-stitched quilt on her bed. All of it reduced to $3. She did not reach for the money immediately. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said, and her voice was as steady as his. She turned and walked out of the office, up the stairs to her small room. The promised bag was there, on her bed. It contained 2 dresses, a brush, and a bar of soap. She opened her own small satchel, the one she used for collecting rock samples, and placed the bag's contents inside. Then she took the hand lens from her pocket, its brass catching the morning light, and closed her fingers around it. She went back downstairs, walked into the office, and picked up the $3 without a word. Her father was still sitting there, staring at his ledger, a man already forgetting. Etta Mae Calhoun walked out of the house she was born in, and did not look back. The journey was not long in distance, but immense in what it crossed. She walked from the relative order of Main Street, with its faded storefronts and wooden sidewalks, toward the chaotic edge of town, where Silverbend frayed into wilderness. The air was thin, and carried the scent of pine and dust, a smell she had always known as home, but which now felt foreign, unwelcoming. The sun was bright in a pale blue sky, casting sharp shadows that seemed to carve the world into stark definitions of what was hers and what was not. The house was no longer hers. The town, it seemed, was no longer hers either. People she had known her whole life saw her walking with her satchel and turned away, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated reluctance to involve themselves in the quiet, sad dramas of others. They had their own struggles, their own ledgers to balance. She walked past the livery, the smell of hay and horse a familiar comfort, and past the blacksmith shop, the rhythmic clang of the hammer on anvil, a sound as steady as a heartbeat. These were the sounds of a life she was leaving behind with every step. Her destination was the county clerk's office, a small, dusty building attached to the sheriff's station. The clerk was a man named Elias Thorpe, a man whose face seemed permanently puckered from the sourness of his work, which was mostly processing liens and foreclosures. The town was dying, and his desk was its deathbed. She pushed open the heavy oak door, a small bell announcing her arrival with a tinny jingle. Elias looked up over his spectacles, his expression unchanging. "Etta Mae," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "What can I do for you?" She walked to the counter, her worn boots making little sound on the dusty floorboards. She placed her satchel on the floor beside her. "I'd like to see the list of tax-delinquent properties," she said. Her voice was clear, without a tremor. Elias blinked slowly. This was not a request he often received from a young woman with a traveling bag. He pulled out a large, leather-bound book and opened it on the counter, its pages brittle and yellowed. He ran a stained finger down a long column of names and plot numbers. "Not much left that's worth having," he mumbled. "Mostly played-out claims, collapsed shafts, nothing but trouble." Her eyes scanned the list, passing over parcels of land she knew to be worthless scree slopes or inaccessible ravines. Then she saw it, a name she recognized. Croft, S-Claim #47, Assayer's Shack and Registered Shaft, taxes owed, $2.87. It was Jedediah's claim. No, not Jedediah's. Silas Croft. Jedediah had once told her he was a distant relation, that the original claim belonged to a great uncle he'd never met, who had left town suddenly, decades ago. This one, she said, pointing a steady finger. Claim 47. Elias squinted at the entry. The old Croft place? Girl, that shaft collapsed 50 years ago. The shack's no more than a pile of sticks. It's on the north slope. Worthless. I'll take it, she said. She placed her $3 silver on the counter. The sound was definitive. Elias Thorpe stared at the coins, then at her face. He saw no desperation, only a quiet resolve that was unnerving. He shrugged, the gesture of a man who has long since stopped questioning the foolishness of others. He took 2 of the dollars, and 87 cents in smaller coin from his till, pushed a deed form and a pen toward her, and gave her back 13 cents in change. She signed her name, Etta Mae Calhoun, and the property was hers. The journey continued, up the winding path that led out of town and into the hills. The higher she climbed, the more the town shrank below, until it was just a collection of rooftops in a dusty valley. The wind picked up, whispering through the pines, a lonely, ancient sound. Finally, she saw it, a gray, weathered headframe leaning at a drunken angle over a mound of earth and rock that marked the collapsed mine shaft, and beside it, the shack. It was exactly as Elias had described it, a pile of sticks waiting to happen. But it was hers. The shack was small, no more than 12 feet by 12 feet, and it stood against the hillside, as if bracing itself against the inevitable slide back into the earth. The wood of its walls was the color of old bone, bleached by 50 years of sun and scoured by wind and snow. The roof, made of cedar shakes, had mostly given up, its surface a chaotic landscape of curls, splits, and gaping holes through which the pale sky was visible. The door hung from a single rusted hinge, its bottom edge rotted away, and the one window on the south-facing wall was a gaping hole, the glass long gone. Etta Mae set down her satchel and pushed the door open. It protested, with a long, agonized groan. The inside smelled of dust, damp earth, and the faint, musty scent of forgotten things. It was a single room, empty, save for a small, pot-bellied stove in the corner, its iron body covered in a fine layer of orange rust. A built-in bunk, little more than a wooden shelf, was fixed to the far wall, and beneath it were a few splintered boards that might have once been a crate. The floor was rough-hewn planking, and in several places the wood had softened and crumbled, revealing the dark soil beneath. It was a ruin. It was a shell. But as she stood in the center of the small space, the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, she felt not despair, but a flicker of something else. It had 4 walls, or the memory of them. It had a floor. It was a beginning. Her first task was survival. She needed shelter from the coming night, which would be cold at this elevation. Using a sturdy branch, she propped the door shut as best she could. She gathered pine boughs from the forest floor, their needles sharp and fragrant, and stuffed them into the empty window frame, creating a makeshift barrier against the wind. Inside the shack, she used her hands to clear a space on the floor, sweeping away the debris of decades. Dried leaves, mouse droppings, the skeletal remains of insects. She laid out her spare dress as a ground sheet, and her blanket on top of it. It was a meager bed, but it was inside, and that was what mattered. She spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood, breaking dead branches over her knee, and stacking them carefully against the sheltered side of the shack. She had 13 cents, her mother's brush, a change of clothes, and a blanket. And she had this place. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, she sat on the shack's broken stoop and looked out over the valley. The lights of Silverbend were beginning to flicker on, tiny points of warmth in the vast, gathering dark. She felt a profound and aching loneliness, a sense of being utterly adrift. But then she reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the cool, solid brass of Jedediah's hand lens. She remembered his voice, calm and steady. "Look closer," She looked at the shack again, not as a ruin, but as a project. The foundation stones seemed solid. The main timbers of the frame, where they were visible, were thick and hewn from old-growth pine. They were weathered, but not rotten. The stove, though rusted, was intact. It was a puzzle of decay, and every piece of it was a problem she could work on. It was not a home, not yet, but it was a place to put her hands to work, and for Etta Mae Calhoun, that was enough. For 2 weeks, Etta Mae worked from dawn until dusk, her life reduced to a simple rhythm of labor and rest. She found a small, clear spring, 100 yards up the hill, solving her need for water. She set snares, catching 2 rabbits, which she cooked over an open fire, the meat sustaining her through the long days. Her primary focus was the shack. She had no tools, but a sharp-edged rock and her own ingenuity. She scavenged the surrounding woods for fallen timber, dragging logs back to the claim to use for patches. She used the sharp rock to strip bark and shape ends. It was slow, brutal work that left her hands raw and her muscles aching with a fire she had never known. But with each small repair, the shack felt less like a ruin and more like a refuge. She sealed the largest gaps in the walls with a mixture of mud and pine needles, a technique she'd seen used on old trappers' cabins. She managed to rehang the door using strips of leather cut from her worn-out boots, a sacrifice that pained her, but was necessary. The roof was the greatest challenge, but she devised a temporary solution, weaving a thick mat of pine boughs and laying it over the worst of the holes. It wouldn't hold against a heavy snow, but it would keep out the rain and the worst of the night's chill. It was while she was working on the interior that she made the discovery. The pot-bellied stove sat on a hearth of flat stones, and the wall behind it was sheathed in tin as a firebreak. The tin was loose, and as she tried to clean behind it, her hand brushed against a section of the wooden wall that felt different. While the other boards were rough and solid, one felt smooth along its edge, and it gave slightly under pressure. Curiosity piqued. She stopped her work. She ran her fingers along the seam, barely visible in the dim light. It was a single plank, about 2 feet long, set vertically between 2 studs. There were no visible nails. She tried to pry it with her fingers, but it wouldn't budge. She went outside and returned with a flattened, sturdy piece of oak she had been using as a makeshift lever. Carefully, she worked the end into the seam at the bottom of the board and gently pried. The wood groaned in protest, and then, with a soft crack, the top of the board popped free. It wasn't nailed in. It had been fitted into grooves, a hidden panel. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She pulled the board away and peered into the dark cavity of the wall. Inside, nestled in a space packed with old horsehair insulation, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied securely with twine. It was heavy. She reached in and lifted it out, her hands trembling slightly. She set it on the floor, the oilcloth stiff and cool to the touch. With fumbling fingers, she untied the twine, the knot dry and brittle with age. She unfolded the oilcloth. Inside were 3 things. The first was a small but heavy leather pouch, cinched tight with a drawstring. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. It was filled with coarse gold dust, glittering with a deep, buttery light. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. The second was a roll of thick vellum papers, tied with a faded red ribbon. The third was a sealed envelope, with the words, "To a worthy finder," written on the front in a neat, decisive hand. She picked up the letter, her mind reeling. This was not an accident. This was left here, deliberately, for someone. For her. She sat on the floor of her half-repaired shack, the last of the evening light filtering through the pine boughs in the window, and carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope. The paper inside was thick and of good quality, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. She unfolded it and began to read. The voice that emerged from the page was calm, precise, and filled with a weary dignity. To the one who finds this, October 12, 1878. My name is Silas Croft. I am, or was, an assayer, and the original claimant of this property. If you are reading this, It means I did not return, and it means you have found the small legacy I was forced to leave behind. I pray you are a person of good character, for what I am entrusting to you was born of betrayal and defended with what little cunning I possess. I came to this valley with a partner, a man named Alistair Finch. We discovered the main silver lode together, the one that gave this town its name. But Finch was a man of vast ambition and shallow integrity. While I worked the geology, he worked the investors. He grew rich and powerful, the founder of Silverbend, while I remained his hired expert. I did not mind this, for my love was for the rock, not the money. But then, on this very claim, I found something else. Not silver, but gold. A small, rich vein of quartz gold, running deep and true. I kept the discovery quiet, intending to file the claim myself, as was my right. But Finch found out. He offered to buy me out for a pittance. When I refused, he threatened me. He made it clear that he owned this town, the sheriff, the judge, and that I would leave with nothing, or not at all. I knew I could not fight him, so I made a plan. The main shaft of this mine follows a fault line. I used the last of my blasting powder to create a cave-in, a strategic collapse that sealed the main shaft completely. It was seen as a tragedy, a worthless claim lost forever. But it was a deception. The real treasure, the gold vein, does not lie down that shaft. It runs perpendicular to it, on a different level, its entrance concealed. The blueprints I have enclosed will show you. The vein begins directly beneath this shack. The gold dust in the pouch is all I could pan in secret before I had to flee. It is not a fortune, but it should be enough for tools, supplies, and a proper start. Use it wisely. The blueprints are my life's work in this place. Study them. They are accurate. The entrance I prepared is beneath the hearthstone of the stove. It is a small, vertical shaft, just wide enough for one person, leading down 20 feet to the main drift. I shored it with timber, but 50 years is a long time. Be careful. I leave this here, in the hope that one day, someone with patience and an honest heart will find it. Alistair Finch built his town on stolen silver and threats. Perhaps you can build a life on the gold he could not find. I do not know who you are, but I wish you well. May this place, which was a source of sorrow for me, be a source of strength for you. Yours in hope, Silas Croft. Etta May read the letter twice, her hands shaking. She looked at the rusted stove, at the stone hearth she had swept clean a dozen times without a second thought. She unrolled the blueprints. They were beautifully drawn, with precise lines and notations in the same neat hand. One drawing showed a cross-section of the hillside, with the collapsed main shaft clearly marked. And there, beneath the detailed drawing of the shack, was another, smaller shaft, labeled SC Prospect. A dotted line extended from it, marked Quartz Lode, Offie, Gold. It was real. Everything Jedediah had taught her, all the quiet hours spent learning the language of stone, had led her here. She was not just a survivor, she was an heir. Silas Croft, a man she had never met, a distant relative of her only friend, had left her a map, a key, and a purpose. The gold dust changed everything. It was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a tool to be used. The next morning, Etta May walked back down the mountain into Silverbend, her step light and sure. She went not to her father's general store, but to the smaller, independent mercantile at the other end of town, run by a quiet man named Miller. She bought a new claw hammer, a box of nails, a good bucksaw, 2 sacks of flour, beans, salt, and a slab of bacon. She paid in gold dust, weighed carefully on Mr. Miller's brass scale. He asked no questions, his face betraying only a flicker of surprise, before settling back into its usual placid neutrality. Word would travel, she knew, but she did not care. The work ahead was all that mattered. The first phase of her rebuilding was to make the shack a proper home. With real tools, the work that had taken her weeks could be accomplished in days. She systematically replaced the rotted planks in the walls. The sharp, clean scent of newly sawn pine filling the small space. She bought a single pane of glass from the freight office and carefully set it into the window frame, sealing it with pitch. The light that now streamed into the room was clear and bright, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners. For the roof, she needed help. She approached Mr. Abernathy, a retired carpenter who lived in a small house cluttered with birdhouses he carved for a living. He was an old man with hands knotted like ancient tree roots, but his eyes were sharp. She offered to pay him for his time. He looked at her, then up at the shack on the hill, and shook his head. "Don't need your money, girl," he said, his voice raspy. "But I won't see a roof put on wrong. I'll show you how to split a shake and lay a course. You'll do the work." For 3 days, they worked together, the old man directing, Etta May providing the labor. He taught her how to find the grain in a block of cedar, how to use a froe and mallet to split perfect, straight shakes. He showed her how to stagger the courses so the roof would shed water and snow for 100 years. He never spoke of her father or her circumstances, but on the last day, as they looked up at the finished, watertight roof, he nodded slowly. "Good work," he said, and that simple praise felt more valuable than gold. With the shack secure, she turned her attention to the hearth. The blueprints showed the shaft entrance was beneath the largest central hearthstone. It was a massive piece of granite, 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. She could not move it alone. She thought of who in town had the strength and the discretion to help. Her mind settled on Tom Gable, a young man who ran the livery stable. He was quiet, like her, and known to be reliable. She found him shoeing a horse, the air filled with the smell of hot iron. She explained that she needed a stone moved inside her cabin. She offered to pay. Like Mr. Abernathy, he refused her money. "I'll bring a winch and rollers tomorrow morning," he said, not missing a beat with his hammer. No charge. The next morning, as promised, he arrived with a heavy-duty block and tackle. Together, they rigged it to the central ceiling beam, which Mr. Abernathy had assured her was sound. Slowly, painstakingly, they lifted the great stone, inch by inch, until it swung free. Beneath it was not earth, but a square opening, framed with thick, dark timbers. A wooden ladder, its rungs slick with damp, descended into the darkness. It was just as Silas Croft had written, a door to a new world, hidden in plain sight. The community of Silverbend, which had once seemed so indifferent, began to coalesce around her, not with words of pity or welcome, but with quiet, practical acts. Her solitary work on the hillside had become a subject of curiosity, and then of a slow, unfolding respect. People saw the new roof, the glass in the window, the curl of smoke from the stovepipe, and they understood it as a statement of intent. She was not passing through. She was putting down roots in the hardest soil imaginable. Mrs. Gable, Tom's mother, a round, kind-faced woman who ran the town's small boarding house, began making the trek up the hill once a week. She would arrive with a basket containing a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of soup, and a bit of town gossip. She never stayed long, but her presence was a comforting warmth, a thread connecting Etta May to the life of the town. "A body needs a hot meal they didn't cook themselves," she would say, patting Etta's arm before heading back down the path. Mr. Miller at the Mercantile started setting aside things for her. A slightly dented can of peaches, a length of rope that was too short for his other customers, a crate of candles with crooked wicks. "Might as well go to use," he'd mutter, adding them to her order without charge. Etta May, in turn, began to contribute. When she started her careful work in the small mine, following Silas Croft's map, she found the quartz vein almost immediately. It was not a spectacular strike, but a steady, reliable seam of rock laced with gold. Using a hammer and chisel, she painstakingly chipped away samples, carrying them up in a bucket. She learned to crush the ore and pan it in the nearby spring. The slow swirl of water and sediment, revealing the heavy, shining flakes of gold. The first time she brought a small pouch of her own gold dust to Mr. Miller's store, a quiet hush fell over the few customers present. She was no longer the cast-off daughter. She was a miner, a producer. She became a part of the town's economic heartbeat, however faint it might be. She was the girl on the Croft claim, a name spoken with a note of wonder. The shack, once a symbol of her destitution, became her fortress. It was small, but tight and warm. She built shelves for her supplies, a small table and a chair. The pot-bellied stove, its rust scoured away, glowed with a constant, cheerful heat. The sound of her hammer and chisel, echoing faintly from the shaft beneath the floor, became the rhythm of her new life. She worked methodically, carefully, never taking more than she needed, always shoring up the tunnel with new timbers as she went, just as the blueprints instructed. The unwanted shack, bought with $3 of spite, had transformed from a burden into a home, a livelihood, and a place of profound peace. It was more than a shelter. It was proof of her own resilience, and proof of a stranger's faith, a faith that had waited patiently in the dark for 50 years. One evening in late autumn, as the aspens in the valley turned a brilliant, trembling gold, Etta May sat at her small table. A fire crackled in the stove, its warmth pushing back the evening's chill. The air in the shack was filled with the smell of pine smoke and brewing coffee. The hearthstone was propped against the wall, and the open shaft was covered with a sturdy wooden hatch she had built with Tom Gable's help. The mine was quiet for the night, her work done for the day. Her hands, no longer soft, were calloused and strong, traced with the fine black lines of rock dust that never quite washed away. On the table in front of her, two objects sat side by side in the warm lamplight. One was Jedediah's brass hand lens, its metal worn smooth from years of use, its glass a clear, focused eye. The other was a piece of quartz she had brought up from the mine that afternoon. It was milky white, and shot through with a delicate, fern-like tracery of pure gold, the most beautiful piece she had yet found. It was a piece that Silas Croft, in a margin note on his blueprint, had called the heart of the vein. She picked up the lens, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. She held it over the piece of ore, just as Jedediah had taught her, and leaned in close. The lens magnified the intricate, secret world within the rock, revealing the gold, not as a solid mass, but as a crystalline structure of breathtaking complexity. She thought of the two men she had never met, bound together by this small piece of land. Silas, the careful planner who had turned an act of betrayal into a hidden gift, leaving behind a map for a future he would never see, and Jedediah, the patient teacher who had given her the eyes to read that map, who had taught her to find value where others saw only worthless stone. Her father had given her $3 to make her disappear. He had seen her as a liability, an entry to be cleared from his life's ledger. He had cast her out with what he believed was nothing. But in his cold, administrative cruelty, he had inadvertently given her everything. He had given her the key to this shack, to this hidden mine, to this quiet, solid life she was building, with her own two hands. She was not rich, not in the way Alistair Finch had been rich, but she was secure. She owed nothing to anyone. She had a warm home, meaningful work, and the quiet respect of her neighbors. She had a place in the world that was entirely her own. What is it, truly, to be left something of value? It is rarely the grand inheritance, the chest of gold coins, or the deed to a sprawling estate. More often, the things that shape us are smaller, quieter, and carry a different kind of weight. It might be a tool, passed from one hand to another. A tool that holds not just the memory of its former user, but the knowledge of how to build, how to create, how to repair. It is the quiet competence, instilled by a patient teacher, the lesson that teaches you not what to think, but how to see. It is the unexpected kindness of a neighbor who brings soup on a cold day, a gesture that says, without words, you are not alone. Etta May's inheritance was not $3. It was a legacy woven from the integrity of one man and the wisdom of another. Silas Croft left her a chance, a carefully preserved opportunity hidden from the greedy and the cruel. Jedediah Croft left her the skill to recognize that chance, and the knowledge to act on it. One gave her the map. The other taught her how to read the terrain. The community of Silverbend gave her the scaffolding of support that allowed her to begin the work. Her father, in his own way, gave her the most crucial gift of all, the push into a life of her own making. He intended it as an ending, but it was a beginning. He handed her a pittance, but she used it to purchase her own sovereignty. Etta Mae Calhoun was 20 years old when she was cast out with $3 to her name. She spent it on a collapsed mine shaft and a ruined shack on a worthless claim. It was the best $3 she ever spent. It is a story that reminds us to look closer, to see the potential that lies dormant in the forgotten and discarded places, both in the world around us and within ourselves. For true value is so rarely found on the surface. It lies hidden, waiting for a worthy finder, waiting for a hand willing to do the work.